This is my final web lecture in the series that I've put online to help you prepare for the design ethics assignment this year. In this lecture I'm going to be focusing on designing behaviour in an ethical way. Essentially I'm trying to answer the question, how can we design behaviour for people, but also how can we do this in a way that's ethical? An important point to note is that you're now entering the world of my theories. This is based on my own research and is not necessarily easy to find anywhere else. It's very much my view. So please take that as your warning. I hope that it might give you a tool to help you think about the ethics of designing behaviour and to examine your own solutions that you created for this project. It seems to me that there are three possible approaches to deliberately designing behaviour. The first one is a category I'm calling. The first one is what I would call persuasion. Persuasion is based on the idea that you want to try and influence people to do what is good, not necessarily what they want. And you do this, but you do this through rational arguments. You give them the same chance to do both types of behaviour, but you hope that your arguments will win them over. The second approach is what I'm calling a nudge. Nudges make it easier to do the thing that is good and make it less easy or less obvious to do the thing that you maybe want to do but is not so good. Nudges allow the user to still make a choice, but you make it much more easy, much more attractive to do the thing that is good. The final approach I'm calling scripts. A script basically says this is how you do the good thing, and you don't allow the user to do anything other than the good thing. So let me go through these and give you some examples to try and help you understand them. Persuasion can be seen as the process of trying to move one or more people by using credible information, evidence, reasoning, and emotional appeals to a new or changed belief, attitude, value, or behaviour. Important thing to think about is that persuasion is not the same as forcing someone to do something. You're not actually using force, you're not holding a gun to their head, you're giving them reasoned arguments. A second thing that persuasion is not is manipulation. For example, if I was to say to you, watch this lecture or I will commit suicide, I would be manipulating you. So persuasion still respects the autonomy, still respects the rationality of the user, and doesn't use tactics like manipulation. The third thing that persuasion is not coercion. It isn't, for example, blackmailing people to do things because you have information about them that they don't want the outside world to know about. Coercion, again, is a type of force. It's maybe not as immediate as holding a gun to someone's head, but it can be just as powerful. The final thing that persuasion is not is propaganda. Persuasion doesn't just show one side of the argument. It tries to show both sides of the argument, but give you reasons for why one approach or one action is better than the other. An old-fashioned model of persuasion is the idea of Aristotle. Aristotle is the person that we talked about in terms of virtue. And Aristotle had a model of persuasion that had a persuader and a receiver, and the persuader could use three types of argument to try and win them over. These are called ethos, pathos, and logos. So if we look at logos are basically rational arguments that persuade. This is things like facts, figures, logical proofs, and alternative views. So a good persuasive argument would have a rational element to it. The second element would be pathos. This is basically emotional arguments persuade. These are aimed at encouraging a favourable response or a favourable attitude to the receiver, but they should be appropriate. So you can say, for example, why an action would make you happy, or not doing it would make you less happy as a person. This is appealing to emotion. It should be not pushing too hard and not actually lying. It should be the truth. This action could make you happier, and again, it could explain why. The final element is ethos. Ethos is where you prove that as a persuader that you're credible, that you're honest, that you're acting from goodwill, that you're doing it with the best interests of the person you're trying to persuade at heart. And finally, that you're competent, that the information you give is good information and you know what you're talking about. This model's quite an interesting one, I think, because despite being very old, it's actually quite an interesting combination. If you look at your persuasive arguments, do they contain ethos, i.e. proof that you're actually a credible person to be able to believe? Do they use some emotional appeals? Do they include pathos? And are you adding rational arguments? It might be interesting to look at your own persuasive arguments to see if they contain all of these elements and if they're contained in the right sort of levels. Let's have a look at an example of persuasion. This is called a footprint calculator, and it was set up for the World Natuurfonds. And the idea is that you can use this to measure your impact on the world in terms of your carbon footprint, your ecological footprint, as they say. The idea here is that you can fill in information and then get a readout that suggests how big your impact on the world is, and also gives you ideas of ways of changing your behaviour so that you can actually have less of an impact. In this sense, it's persuasion because it's actually presenting you with reasonable arguments. It's giving you information. It's allowing you to make choices. Key thing here is that it's respecting your autonomy. It's giving you the full chance to make decisions yourself. It's giving you good information to do this. This, for me, seems to be a very good example of persuasion. Let's move on now to nudges. A nudge is something that makes it easier to do something good. It doesn't force you, but it makes it easier to do something good. It doesn't necessarily present arguments. It uses our psychology to help us do things that might be seen as good. A couple more examples of nudges. This is a classic. This is one I found in Germany during a World Cup. And this is to help gentlemen aim more accurately when they're using the urinal. Very similar to the fly, which is quite popular to be engraved on urinals in Dutch toilets. Another example is this alarm clock. Essentially, this is very similar to the condom in the bag that we saw earlier. The idea is you can set the alarm, and if you have a habit of snoozing too often and eventually not waking up again, what this does is you set the alarm, you press snooze, but then it rolls off the table and goes away, and the next time it goes off you have to get out of bed to switch it off. Having looked at nudges, we move on now to the third approach that I mentioned, and this is the idea of scripts. A script is essentially nothing more than what it says. A script is where you as a designer script the actions of the user. You design in to your product what the user has to do. You build it in a way that they don't have any choice. So what you're doing is essentially taking away their autonomy. You're delegating the moral responsibility or the responsibility for action to the product. You take away their autonomy. Some examples of scripts. This is a public seating, and this has been designed specifically to prevent people from lying on it. So the product has a script in it which says do not lie in it, and it makes it impossible to actually do this. This is actually to try and stop people who live on the streets, homeless people, from sleeping on benches. Next is an example that's perhaps more familiar to you. This is essentially the behavioural password system. Basically, the designer has designed in rules that say your password has to be a minimum of 8 characters, a maximum of 16 characters. It must contain at least 1 digit and 1 special character. It also may not contain your behavioural ID, and it can't be the same as your last password. This is literally, I think literally in this case, scripted in. If you want to use the behavioural system, then you have to design your password in this way. This is done so that you make more secure passwords, but it does mean that you have no choice in the matter. This is a very good example of a script. So these are the 3 approaches that I think you can take to behavioural design or to designing behaviour. The question I now ask is, how can we ensure we do this in an ethical manner? How do we ethically design behaviour? First thing I'd like to mention is that based on the idea of autonomy, certain approaches offer a lot more autonomy than other approaches. So if we look on the left, I've got the idea of persuasion. Here, the autonomy of the user is very high. Essentially what you're doing is you're treating the user as a rational moral being with autonomy, and you're giving them choices. You're giving them information to allow them to make choices, and you're trying to show them the better option, but you're giving them complete freedom to decide what to do. At the other end, on the right, you've got scripts. Here, as you've already seen, the autonomy of the user is very, very low. And in between, you have a nudge where the user has some autonomy, but you try and influence them to make it easier without using persuasion. You make it easier for them to do the good action, or the action that you want them to do. So taking this into account, we can look at how we can do this. Earlier I mentioned that sometimes users don't want very much choice at all. So if we look at this grid, on the left-hand side, there are three options. The user would like little or no choice, some choice, or freedom of choice. Across the top, you have your option as a designer. In order to achieve the good, you need to give the user little or no choice, some choice, or freedom of choice. If you look at the green boxes, if it agrees that the user and what you need to do to achieve the good are the same, then morally it doesn't seem to be very much of a problem. The problem issues come around the red ones and the orange ones. The orange ones are where there seems to be some conflict, and perhaps you need to be careful as a designer which pattern you use to ensure that the user will be persuaded or be nudged or scripted to do the right thing. However, the red ones are where there's a very, very big difference between what the user wants and what you need to do as a designer. These red ones are where you have to think about the design pattern that you're using. If you use this design pattern, you're actually taking away autonomy from users, or you're giving them more choice than they want, and as a result you're making their life more difficult, and you may indeed be reducing their moral autonomy. And this, as I've already mentioned a number of times, is a serious issue, and is something perhaps that you need to think clearly about.